What if everything you thought you knew about angels was incomplete? For centuries, believers have wrestled with haunting questions the Bible hints at but never fully explains. Who were the Nephilim? What did fallen angels really look like? And why does Scripture warn that the end times would resemble the days of Noah? Today, we're pulling back the veil connecting the Bible with ancient history to uncover a truth that may change how you see the spiritual world, human history, and what's coming next. What if the Bible has been quietly telling us a story most people never slow down long enough to hear? I remember the first time I really stopped on Genesis chapter 6. I had read it dozens of times before the sons of God saw the daughters of men. But this time it bothered me. Not in a scary way, but in a why don't we ever talk about this kind of way. Growing up in church, I heard about Noah, the ark, the flood, judgment, and obedience, but almost never about why the world became so corrupt that God intervened so dramatically. Scripture says there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, giants, men of renown, and then it moves on. That silence creates attention, because if God destroyed the world over something, it probably matters more than we realize. So let's start with the core question. Who were the Nephilim really? And just as importantly, what did the fallen angels look like who fathered them? Genesis 6 tells us that the sons of God came into the daughters of men and children were born to them. Those children weren't ordinary. They were described as mighty, famous, powerful. The Hebrew language doesn't suggest tall basketball players or symbolic metaphors. It describes something other, something abnormal. And here's where many people get uncomfortable. Because once you accept that these were not merely human figures, you're forced to ask whether the Bible is describing a supernatural corruption of humanity itself. Now I know what some people immediately say, angels can't do that. But the Bible never says angels can't. It says they don't, meaning they weren't created for marriage. That's very different from saying they were incapable of rebellion. In fact, Scripture repeatedly shows angels breaking divine boundaries. Jude tells us some angels left their proper dwelling. Peter says they were imprisoned for what they did. Something happened, something serious enough to warrant judgment before the flood even arrived. And here's where lived experience matters. When you spend enough time watching the world, watching cycles repeat, watching corruption repackage itself, you realize something unsettling. Evil doesn't invent new strategies. It recycles old ones. That's why Jesus' words hit so hard. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. Not just violence, not just immorality, but conditions. Spiritual, genetic, societal conditions. So what did these fallen angels look like? The Bible gives us clues, but not in modern Hollywood terms. When Scripture describes certain high-ranking angels like seraphim and cherubim, it doesn't use soft human imagery. It describes beings with multiple faces, wings, fire eyes, and non-human features. Seraphim are literally described with a word connected to serpents or burning beings. That alone should challenge the idea that angels always look like glowing humans with halos. Across ancient cultures, Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, Greek, you see strikingly consistent imagery, serpent-like beings, shining beings, watchers, gods who descend from heaven and interact with humanity. Cultures separated by oceans told the same story with different names. That consistency matters. People often dismiss this as mythology. But mythology doesn't usually agree across continents unless it's preserving memory. When multiple civilizations describe towering beings with glowing eyes, elongated skulls, supernatural strength, and divine authority, it raises a question: what were they remembering? The Nephilim, according to Scripture, were not just tall. They were hybrids, the product of heavenly rebellion and human flesh. That's why they were feared. That's why they were famous. And that's why God intervened. Think about it this way. If you corrupt humanity at its root, body, mind, and spirit, you don't just ruin individuals. You sabotage the future. You interfere with the very line through which redemption would come. And that explains something else I used to struggle with. Why was the flood so total? Why not just judge the worst people? Because the issue wasn't just behavior, it was contamination. Genesis hints that all flesh had become corrupt, not just morally, something deeper. And this isn't abstract theology. We live in a world obsessed with altering humanity, genetics, identity, boundaries, definitions. We celebrate it as progress. But Scripture warns us that crossing certain lines doesn't lead upward, it leads back to judgment. That realization didn't come from fear. It came from pattern recognition. The Bible isn't trying to scare us, it's trying to prepare us. And this brings us to a critical turning point, because once you understand who the Nephilim were, the next unavoidable question is this: did they only exist before the flood? Or did something survive? That's where things get even more unsettling and where we're going next. One of the most common assumptions people make is that the flood wiped everything clean, that once the waters receded, the Nephilim were gone for good. Case closed. Problem solved. But the Bible itself refuses to let us stay comfortable with that conclusion. Because just a few chapters after Noah steps off the ark, the story gets strange again. Fast forward to Numbers 13. The Israelites are standing at the edge of the Promised Land. 12 spies go in. 10 come back terrified, and listen carefully to what they say. We saw the Nephilim there. The sons of Anak come from the Nephilim, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight. That line should stop you cold, because the flood already happened. So how are the Nephilim mentioned again? This isn't poetic exaggeration. The spies weren't trying to impress Moses with creative writing. They were afraid for their lives. They were describing something real enough to make trained warriors lose their nerve. This is where many people try to soften the text. They'll say, well, maybe they just meant tall people. But Scripture already has words for tall people. This passage deliberately reaches back to Genesis 6 language. In other words, the Bible itself invites us to ask, was there another incursion? I'll be honest, this was one of the hardest ideas for me to wrestle with. Not because it felt unbiblical, but because it felt too biblical. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Bible never says fallen angels stopped rebelling after the flood. It says some were judged, some were imprisoned, but not all. And when you trace the genealogies, wars, and enemies Israel faced, a pattern emerges. The giants weren't everywhere, but they were always where God's redemptive plan was moving. Think about that. The Anakim, the Rephaim, Og king of Bashan, Goliath and his brothers. These weren't random tall men scattered across history. They were concentrated in specific regions, especially around the land promised to Abraham. That's not coincidence, that's strategy. Now let's talk about appearance, because this is where imagination often outruns Scripture, but Scripture still gives us more than we think. The Bible repeatedly describes these beings as mighty, fearsome, and unnatural. Og's bed alone was over 9 cubits long, kept on display like a trophy. Not because it was furniture, but because it was proof this thing existed. And ancient historians like Josephus, who had no incentive to exaggerate, said the bones of giants were still visible in his day, larger and different from normal human remains. Different. That word matters. Across cultures, giants are not described as simply tall humans. They're described as other, broader, heavier, unusually proportioned, sometimes described with glowing eyes or an overwhelming presence. Even the Hebrew language hints at this. Some terms connected to giants also carry meanings related to terror, healing, or even the dead, suggesting these beings occupied a strange boundary between life, death, and the supernatural. And here's where personal experience kicks in again. If you've ever walked into a room and felt something was off, no words, no explanation, just a weight. You already understand the concept. Not everything threatening looks monstrous. Sometimes it feels monstrous. Ancient people didn't just fear giants because of size, they feared what they represented. These beings were often linked to kingship, warfare, forbidden knowledge, and domination. They ruled cities, they enslaved populations, they demanded worship. That's why pagan religions often deified them after death. Which leads to something most people never connect: the spiritual legacy of the Nephilim didn't end when their bodies died. The Bible hints very carefully that something remained, that the spirits of these hybrid beings didn't go where human spirits go. They wandered. They sought embodiment. They became what later Scripture calls unclean spirits. That realization changes how you read the New Testament. When Jesus confronts demons, they don't act like fallen angels. They act desperate, territorial, angry, afraid of judgment, almost displaced. That's not a side issue. That's continuity. And now here's the tension we need to sit with. If something similar happened after the flood, and if Jesus said the end times would resemble the days of Noah, then the question isn't, did this happen? The real question is it happening again, but in a different form? Because the enemy doesn't repeat tactics exactly. He adapts them. The Nephilim after the flood were fewer, weaker, more limited, but still dangerous. Their power declined over generations. Their bloodlines diluted. Their influence shifted from physical dominance to spiritual control, political power, and deception. That shift matters, because when you stop expecting giants with clubs, you stop noticing giants in suits. And that's where this story gets uncomfortably close to our own time. There's a reason Jesus chose his words so carefully. When he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man," he wasn't just talking about people being sinful. Humanity has always been sinful. That statement wouldn't mean much if it only referred to general wickedness. What made the days of Noah unique was the nature of the corruption. It wasn't just moral decay. It was a deep, systemic distortion of what it meant to be human. And this is where, honestly, the conversation starts to feel uncomfortably close to home. In Noah's time, boundaries were crossed between heaven and earth, between creator and creation, between what God designed and what rebellious beings tried to redesign. The result wasn't chaos right away. It was progress, cities, technology, power, advancement, fame. That's what makes deception so effective. It rarely looks evil at first. Genesis tells us the Nephilim were men of renown. That phrase doesn't mean villains. It means heroes, celebrities, leaders, the ones everyone admired, the ones people wanted to be like. That detail should sober us, because when corruption wears the mask of greatness, most people don't resist it, they celebrate it. I've thought about this a lot in everyday life. We live in an age obsessed with enhancement. Better bodies, better minds, better genetics, better longevity. We're constantly told that limits are outdated, that boundaries are oppressive, that transformation is freedom. And on the surface, it sounds hopeful. But the Bible shows us something critical when humanity tries to transcend God's design without God. The result is not evolution, it's rebellion. That's exactly what happened before the flood. Now let's be clear. Scripture doesn't say fallen angels came down announcing themselves. They didn't land with fire and thunder and say, "We are here to destroy you." They integrated, they influenced, they taught, they ruled. Ancient texts across cultures talk about watchers who taught forbidden knowledge, warfare, metallurgy, enchantments, sorcery, manipulation of nature. Again, people call this mythology. But Genesis itself says, knowledge increased rapidly before the flood. Ask yourself, when knowledge accelerates faster than wisdom, does that usually end well? The Nephilim world was advanced, violent, hierarchical, and spiritually inverted. Humans became expendable. Power mattered more than righteousness. Strength replaced obedience. That's when God stepped in. And here's the part most people miss. God's judgment wasn't reactionary, it was preservational. If the corruption had continued unchecked, there would have been no uncontaminated human line left. Redemption itself would have been impossible. That's why Noah matters. Noah wasn't just a good man. He was described as perfect in his generations. That doesn't mean sinless. It means uncorrupted. His lineage remained intact. That line leads to Christ. Now let's bring this forward. Jesus connects Noah's world to the end times, but he also adds something else people would be eating, drinking, marrying. Building life would seem normal. That's key. No panic, no awareness, no alarm. Which means whatever echoes the days of Noah won't announce itself as evil. It will present itself as progress. And this is where personal reflection hits hard. I've watched people, good people, become numb to things they once would have questioned. Not because they're wicked, but because they're tired, distracted, overloaded. When everything moves fast enough, you stop asking where it's going. That's exactly how deception thrives. The Bible doesn't tell us fallen angels will return in the same way. It tells us their influence will, their strategies, their goals. The same ancient desire to blur lines God set in place. Not necessarily giants walking openly, but systems that normalize corruption, redefine humanity, and erode the image of God piece by piece. This is why the Nephilim story matters now. It's not about chasing myths or obsessing over monsters. It's about recognizing patterns. Whenever humanity starts redefining itself apart from God, whenever power replaces humility, whenever boundaries are treated as enemies, whenever truth becomes flexible and identity becomes fluid, you're watching the same ancient playbook unfold. And here's the most important part. God didn't flood the world because of the Nephilim alone. He flooded it because humanity followed them. That's the warning. Judgment comes not when evil exists, but when it becomes normalized. So what are we supposed to do with this? Not panic, not speculate wildly, not hunt conspiracies, but wake up. Jesus didn't reveal these patterns to scare us. He revealed them to prepare us, to anchor us, to remind us that the antidote to deception isn't knowledge, it's discernment. And discernment begins with knowing who you are, who God is, and where the lines are that must not be crossed. In the next part, we're going to confront a question that naturally follows all of this, and it's one many people feel but rarely articulate. If the Nephilim were hybrids, distortions of humanity, then what does the Bible say about being truly human? And why is that under attack today? Once you start seeing the Nephilim story clearly, a deeper question surfaces, one that feels less ancient and far more personal. What does it actually mean to be human? Because when you strip everything else away, that's what this conflict has always been about. The Nephilim weren't just giants. They were a violation of design, a counterfeit version of humanity, stronger, more powerful, more impressive on the surface, but fundamentally broken at the core. They represented an attempt to improve on God's creation without God. And that attempt didn't begin in Genesis 6, it began earlier. And the serpent's first temptation wasn't violence, it wasn't rebellion, it was enhancement. You will be like God. That lie has never changed, only the packaging has. In Noah's time, the corruption was physical, genetic, and spiritual. Humanity was being reshaped into something else, something that no longer reflected God's image. And Scripture makes something painfully clear: God cares deeply about His image being preserved in humanity. That's why lineage matters so much in the Bible. That's why genealogies exist. That's why Scripture traces bloodlines with almost uncomfortable precision. Modern readers often skip those sections, but ancient readers understood exactly why they mattered. Corruption didn't just spread through ideas, it spread through inheritance. And here's where this gets very real. Today, the conversation has shifted from bloodlines to identity, but the goal is eerily similar. We are told that being human is fluid, optional, self-defined, upgradable, editable. And I want to be clear here, this isn't about attacking people. It's about recognizing patterns. Because deception works best when it convinces you that limits are oppression. But the Bible teaches something radically different: limits are protection. God didn't create boundaries because He wanted to restrict humanity. He created them because He wanted to preserve it. Think about it practically. A river without banks doesn't become freer, it becomes destructive. Fire outside its boundary doesn't become brighter, it burns everything. The Nephilim story is the ultimate example of what happens when boundaries are erased. And that brings us to something most people overlook. Jesus didn't just come to forgive sin, He came to restore humanity. That's why the incarnation matters so much. God didn't send an angel, He didn't send a hybrid, He didn't send a super being, He became fully human. That choice alone tells you how God defines perfection. Jesus didn't arrive enhanced. He arrived embodied, subject to hunger, fatigue, pain, temptation, and yet without corruption, without distortion, without compromise. He is the counterpoint to the Nephilim. Where they were powerful but rebellious, He was obedient. Where they were exalted, He was humble. Where they ruled through fear, He served through love. And this is where modern life collides head-on with ancient truth. We are constantly encouraged to transcend humanity, to merge with technology, to override biology, to redefine creation. It's framed as progress, as compassion, as inevitability. But Scripture gives us a sobering warning: when humanity seeks transcendence without submission, it always ends in loss. I've seen this play out in smaller, everyday ways. People chasing identity through achievement, appearance, power, influence only to feel emptier the more they become. Not because striving is wrong, but because striving without grounding fractures the soul. The Nephilim weren't fulfilled. They were violent, dominant, insatiable. Their greatness didn't bring peace, it brought judgment. And here's something we don't talk about enough. God didn't preserve the Nephilim. He preserved Noah. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, not the most impressive, the faithful. That should recalibrate how we measure success. Because if being human as God designed it is under attack, then the most radical act of resistance today isn't rebellion, it's obedience. It's choosing faithfulness over fascination, discernment over novelty. And yes, that's harder than it sounds. We live in an age where everything screams for attention, where truth competes with spectacle, where ancient wisdom feels slow and inconvenient. But Noah didn't save the world by being innovative. He saved it by being consistent. And that's the quiet challenge for us. If the end times echo the days of Noah, then the call is the same: build an ark before it starts raining. Not a physical one, but a spiritual one. A life anchored in truth. A mind guarded by Scripture. A heart aligned with God's design, not the world's trends. Because when pressure increases, only what's built on truth remains standing. And this leads us to the final unavoidable question, one that ties everything together and forces a personal response. If these patterns are returning, what does God expect from us now? At some point, every conversation about the Nephilim fallen angels in the days of Noah stops being academic. It stops being history. And it becomes personal. Because once you see the pattern, once you recognize that the Bible isn't just describing the past, but warning the future, you're left with a question you can't dodge. What am I supposed to do with this? God never reveals truth just to satisfy curiosity. He reveals it to provoke response. Noah didn't spend decades studying judgment. He spent decades preparing for it. And that distinction matters more than ever. Let's be honest, most of us don't feel like we're living in biblical times. We wake up, go to work, pay bills, scroll our phones, try to be decent people. The world doesn't feel apocalyptic on the surface. But Jesus said the days of Noah would feel normal right up until they weren't. People were marrying, building, planning, dreaming, no alarms, no countdown. Which means the danger isn't chaos, it's complacency. And this is where I've had to check my own heart more than once. It's easy to watch the world and say, things are getting dark. It's harder to ask, am I staying alert or just adapting? Because drifting doesn't require rebellion, it only requires distraction. The Nephilim story reminds us that corruption doesn't always arrive waving a red flag. Sometimes it arrives as opportunity, influence, advancement, acceptance, even compassion when compassion is detached from truth. So what is God asking of us now? First, discernment over fascination. There's a difference between being aware and being consumed. Scripture never tells us to obsess over fallen angels or giants. It tells us to stay sober-minded, grounded, anchored. If learning about the Nephilim makes you more fearful than faithful, you've missed the point. But if it sharpens your awareness of God's holiness, human value, and spiritual reality, then it's doing its job. Second, faithfulness over prominence. The Nephilim were famous. Noah was faithful. And God chose faithfulness. That truth cuts against everything we're taught today. We're told visibility equals impact. Influence equals success. But Scripture consistently shows God working through people who are hidden, obedient, and patient. If you've ever felt overlooked for doing the right thing, you're in good company. Third, obedience over innovation. Noah didn't redesign God's plan. He followed instructions. Exactly. When God gave measurements, materials, and timing, Noah didn't improvise. In a world obsessed with rewriting boundaries, obedience looks outdated. But in God's economy, obedience is survival. That doesn't mean rejecting technology or progress. It means refusing to cross lines God has clearly drawn, especially when crossing them is celebrated. Fourth, hope over fear. This might be the most important one. The Nephilim narrative can sound heavy, dark, even unsettling. But it's not meant to leave us afraid, it's meant to remind us that God has already dealt with this before. The rebellion didn't win. The corruption didn't last. The giants didn't inherit the earth. God did. and he preserved humanity through one faithful family. That tells us something powerful. No matter how overwhelming things look, God is never reacting. He's always ahead. Finally, readiness over speculation. Jesus didn't say figure everything out. He said, be ready. Readiness isn't about having every answer. It's about living aligned with truth even when answers are incomplete. You don't need to know every detail about the Nephilim to live faithfully today. You need to know who God is, who you are in Him, and where your loyalty lies. Because when pressure comes, and it always does, your foundation will decide everything. And here's the quiet encouragement I want to leave you with. You don't need to be Noah to live like Noah. You just need to walk with God when others don't, to trust His word when it's unpopular, to value being human as He designed it, made in His image, not upgraded by rebellion. The days of Noah weren't just a warning. They were a preview of how God rescues those who stay faithful in a corrupt world. And that same God hasn't changed. He's still watching, still calling, still preserving those who choose truth over trend. The question isn't whether history will repeat. The question is where you'll be standing when it does. So when you strip everything down, this isn't really a story about giants, fallen angels, or ancient mysteries. It's a story about faithfulness in a world that keeps crossing lines. The days of Noah remind us that God sees, God remembers, and God preserves those who walk with Him, even when it's unpopular. If this video helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes or stirred you to think deeper, I'd love for you to stay with us. Feel free to like, subscribe, and keep walking this journey.